Your thoughts?
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for to ODI for inviting me. My intervention will follow quite nicely from the previous one. I am indeed going to argue a fairly typical human rights position around media, and argue in particular that the key focus ought to be on the development of system and policies and structures that are amenable to both press freedom and professional reporting. Unfortunately, at the present time, the situation in most of African countries, with a few exceptions, is one of either unfinished business as far as this systemic approach is concerned, or indeed increased setback. The legal reforms have been initiated in the 1990s and more recently as well in the beginning of the 21st century, but it is very much stalled at the moment. The media laws that have emerged suffer from a large number of problems. I'm not going to get into the details because it gets quite technical, but you ought to believe me and many others if I say that the legislative framework simply for the media, the so-called media laws, for instance, are very imperfect and suffers from many imperfections. In addition to that, there is a number of other laws that are either in place as the outcome of the colonial period, or has come up more recently, all of which are further restricting the ability of the media to either work independently or impartially. The key one in the current context, which unfortunately has become a global phenomenon, is anything related to security legislation, all of which are used to impede the ability of the media to work properly. Defamation laws is also a major problem, both criminal and civil, particularly criminal in the context of Africa, and many journalists, most of whom are actually doing good job, found themselves imprisoned or charged. That's just, okay, so that's for the legal context. The second main weakness in the current African context is very poor institutional democratic building process, particularly when it comes to the environment required for the media. I'm just going to focus here on the regulatory bodies. Any system which plans or aims to be independent, free, as far as the media is concerned, needs to have very strong regulation. It may sound strange, but it goes with the territory. In order for independence and freedom to give everything that it could give to society, you actually need a good regulatory framework. And you need good independent regulatory bodies that are going to make sure that this framework is well implemented. There is not one country in Africa where this regulatory framework is in place at the moment. Even South Africa has a lot of limits. Most of the regulatory bodies are not independent. Their members are nominated by the government. There is no multi-party system that regulates the regulatory bodies. The licensing of private broadcasters is done either on a market base or on a political basis. There are no objective criteria which guides the allocation of the licenses. Objective criteria as we will understand them. Again, I can give you a number of examples. The outcome of that is a media that is operating without what we consider, after many years of experience within Article 19 and elsewhere, as really the sine qua non condition for professional, independent, proper reporting and for the media to be able to play its role in an emerging democracy. The third weakness of the current system is related to a focus on pluralism at the expense of diversity. We've seen throughout the 1990s a huge focus on liberalization of the airways, which meant basically let's open the airways to the private sector, which is all good. You have more private actors who are taking a stake in the licensing and opening their radio and so on. All is well there, notwithstanding the importance of regulation. The problem is that we have put far less focus on diversity. There is pluralism of media ownership. There is no diversity of media reporting. or a very bad diversity or biased diversity. All of that is not the end of the road. I mean, you can still move forward, but what it means is that we do need to place as much emphasis on the principle of diversity, probably as we have done in the previous decade on the pluralism. I'm just going to make a little divergence here to highlight the fact that actually we are now in a context that is very different from the 1990s. And the diversity questions is becoming far more complex because of the technological development, and particularly the mobile technology. The African subcontinent has actually gone through the fastest growth in terms of mobile, access to mobile. Between 2003 and 2008, the number of cell phone subscription has grown from 11 million to 246. It's the biggest growth in the world, even bigger than Asia, according to the ITU, which presumably knows what they are talking about. And while less than 3% of rural areas in Africa have landline telephone connection, the ITU estimated that over 40% of these areas have phone access via cell phone. That's one thing. Over the last maybe a bit more, 5 years, there has been a multiplication of usage of the cell phone. SMS news, I was in Kenya recently, and the number of people who get their news through SMS is amazing. Of course, banking, we all know that. It has been shown all over our Western television. And increasingly, internet access. It's still not quite there. It's still a bit expensive, but there is absolutely no doubt that within the next few years, most people in Africa with a mobile phone will be able to access internet. That is going to raise a lot of questions regarding diversity of content, diversity of information, and regulation, particularly media versus telecommunication regulations. I'm not going to go there more, but those are key issues for us to address as we are looking at the fragile state questions. In my conclusion, I just wanted to highlight what I think is actually a very good, for me, I mean, and it needs more research, but I think a positive example, and it's Kenya, and it's the latest referendum, the 2008 referendum that has just taken place at the beginning of August, and everyone in Kenya and elsewhere was very scared to see a repeat of what had happened at the end of 2007. This didn't happen, and it didn't happen on a preliminary basis, I said, for a number of reasons. The first one is, of course, that people have learned. I think they were very scared to see a repeat, and they were committed. The majority of the Kenyans were really committed not to see that repeat again. And I think that's quite essential in terms of building a mature political system at all levels. Second, I think, and the point I want to make here, is that throughout that period, the political establishment overall, and the justice sector, and the various civil society or institutions established after 2007 tried to really hold to account those that needed to be held to account. And while they made a lot of comments regarding the vernacular media, they actually didn't charge anyone within the media sector. They focused on the politicians, because those were the people who are at the heart of the problem, not the journalists, not the vernacular language, little radio over there. It's the people who are using those systems to put forward their terrible ideologies. So throughout the last 3 months preceding the referendum, there was a lot of talks in the media, in governments, in parliaments around incitement to hatred. There were 3 or 4 MPs that were charged for incitement to hatred. I don't think it has gone too far after that. And there was actually no action taken against the media except positive action, which is from the beginning of the year until July, the various subcommissions created by the government went all over the country to raise awareness with the journalists, local journalists, with the media, about their responsibility vis-à-vis the referendum. The media itself, in the following 2007, invested a lot in its own development. There were code of conduct. I think in the vast majority, media owners were also committed not to see a repeat of 2007-2008. I think the Kenya pre-referendum period actually ought to be studied, because I think it is a fantastic example of a country that has shown political maturity and of a people that has shown political maturity in handling a very difficult, very sensitive questions, and of the media that actually has done pretty well in the context of a fragile state. Thank you.
Anya, thank you very much. You are, I think, laying a lot of the problems. You acknowledge there are real issues with the media and how it's covering issues and the degree to which it's potentially, as I think Elizabeth was sort of pointing out, a system that is has systemic problems of increasingly being co-opted by special interests in society, of increasingly being corrupted, of increasingly polarized, and that this is not the fault of journalists, and it's not the fault principally of individuals. It is a systemic problem, and you're pointing to the reason why that's come about is because of poor regulation or inefficient and effective regulation, or that's one of the key reasons. And then you talk about the complications of regulating it, given the new technologies and the vastly new challenges in terms of how people are accessing information. I wasn't sure whether we should leave that being optimistic or quite pessimistic in terms of, okay, what are the options available to regulators? We've had a lot of time, since 1989, it's a long time to get regulation right, which is, 1989 was really the full force of liberalization of media really hit home in a lot of Africa and other countries as well across the world. Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic in terms of actually getting these regulatory systems? Do regulatory systems constitute the answer here?
2 points. One, I think we need to recognize that the regulation of Western media has taken far more than 15 years. So on a comparative basis, they're not doing that badly. The second point, I like to be optimistic by nature, otherwise I will not be a human rights activist. I think that there are real challenges which are not just about Africa. The questions of how do we regulate the media in an impartial, proper way when there are so many other sources of information is a challenge to everybody. In the context of Africa, where the institutions are still very fragile, it raises a bit more quagmires and uncertainties. I think there is a school of thought, for instance, which is arguing that the regulation of telecommunication and the regulation of the media should come together. And in many ways, some media regulators are admitting to us and to themselves in Africa that, actually their role is becoming a bit, without much consequences, because some of the worst, information is actually not coming from the media, but from other sources which are under the telecommunication regulation. I think there are solutions, and I think people are actually in Africa right now working very hard to try to find, policies and systems that will fit their
But just before coming on to James, I mean, there is a fundamental issue here. You seem to be advocating really for quite a strong level of regulation, particularly in fragile settings. Perhaps quite a stronger level of regulation than perhaps would be acceptable in the United States, for example. I'm trying to sort of get under the skin of what we mean by good regulation.
I'm talking mostly, I was talking mostly here about the regulatory bodies.
Right.
And I think the regulatory bodies across the established democracies are more or less the same. There is not fundamental differences. There are fundamental or a little bit of differences in terms of the legal landscape. So in the United States, you have a legal landscape which is more which has a lower threshold for so-called incitement to hatred or hate speech than in Europe, but you also have a higher threshold in the United States for anything that, a pair of two breasts being shown on television. So yes, there are differences in terms of the legal landscape, and which will be reflected in the African context. But I'm not necessarily arguing for more stronger regulations. I'm just saying let's try first with putting in place a regulatory framework, both in terms of institutions, policies, and laws that meet best standard. If it's not enough, if it doesn't work, then we can start criticizing and trying to look for alternative models. The thing is, we are arguing for alternative models where we have not tried them yet.
Agnès, thank you very much indeed.